So what do you admire most about Nora?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there's a quiet perseverance in her that I admire. You know, she lost her husband. For some reason we don't know. They never had children. She has found a way to, you know, move forward in her life. She seems, you know, when we first meet her, she seems to have found a balance, you know, between her own sort of solitude and her connection with the town, which seems to be a nice balance for her. So we kind of meet her in that place. And, you know, I think I love her, you know, she's a kind of every woman, but sort of quietly independent and self-sufficient and both caring towards the town and yet able to sort of be her own woman.
Logistically or emotionally, what was the most challenging scene?
Well, there are some scenes. It's interesting. This film, more than any film I've ever made, has transformed itself. So we started out with a script and actually shot fairly close to the script. And I think in the year that Tom was editing it and working on it, the film in his own mind transformed itself into quite a different film than the film that we started out with. You know, the film in my imagination, having read it for many months and then shot it, was a very different film. When I sat down and actually saw it, I was like, wow, I love this film, but it's a completely different film than we were, in a sense, forming, you know, when we were shooting it. Maybe not in Tom's mind, I don't know, you know, but he shot a lot of scenes which in the end are not a part of the film, although they may have played into his development of the film, like in the sense of as the film grew in his own imagination, you know, some of the scenes I think fell away. So there's a long scene we shot. Was probably maybe the longest scene in the film, about a 10-minute scene in which I first go in after I get the letter saying my job is done. I had a scene where I go in and I really confront the guys who are in charge of the post office, the regional guys. And there were, in the scene as it is now, there are only 2, but when we shot it, there were, I think, 7 different guys who I am with at one point, and then I think some of them leave, and I'm left with those 2. And I think that scene was the most complex scene to navigate emotionally, because she goes in very distressed and angry, and you know, I walk in and I literally, you know, refuse to leave the lobby where the secretary is trying to tell me they don't have time to see me. And I sit down and I refuse to leave until they'll make time to see me. So she, you know, there's that piece of her that's you know, very confrontational in the earlier version of the film, which as she goes in and as they try to, in a way, kind of bamboozle her out of her response and feeling betrayed and feeling not very respected after 35 years of being a postmaster, that they would just send her a letter in the mail saying, sorry, your job is over. She feels very undermined by that, as most people would. And I think that was the most challenging film, but it's challenging scene. But you don't get to see it. You see little pieces of it. I think, you know, the scene. You know, when I watch the film now, the scene that, in a sense, navigates emotionally through is probably where I go in and beg him to let me continue for five more years.
It's interesting that, like, having seen the film now and having you describe, you know, confrontation with this character, I'm like, that doesn't seem in character for this. But then I'm like,
it's interesting. I mean, there were a number of major confrontations that Nora has. In fact, you know, I don't want to talk about scenes that aren't in the film, because why bother?
How do you personally deal with like bad news?
Deal with bad news. Oh, and I you know, get a lot of it sometimes. You know, I suppose it just has to do with the frame of mind I'm in at the time. I mean, I try to be a kind of equanimous person, you know, like to be in a place where I can absorb bad news as just being a part of the landscape of being a human being alive on the planet. But, you know, I can be pretty reactive sometimes. You know, I suppose it depends on what it is and whether or not I think there's anything I can do about it, or, you know, if there are things that are just happening that are completely out of my control. And, you know, I mean, we live in a world just filled with bad news these days. Every time I open my computer, like there's some bad news in front of me. And, you know, sometimes I'm willing to, you know, take it on and take it in and get riled up about it. And other times I'm just like, go away, you know. It's like I can't deal with it, you know. I would say I have, and this goes back to my childhood, I'm a real problem solver. Like, give me the problems, let me take care of them. I'm like, I want to be challenged in that way. I want people to give me problems to solve. And I feel kind of in my element when I'm problem solving. So in that sense, I think I deal with bad news fairly well. But sometimes there's bad news and there's bad news. You know, it's bad news. There's no way you can solve the problem, and those are the really hard ones, right?
One of the interesting things for me was so I grew up in like a big city, so we didn't have like a small post or whatever. But the sense of community that kind of like built up around the Colewell office.
Yeah.
So I'm curious as to where's your little like sense of home, community, people gathering? Like, where do you find solace in your life?
Yeah, you know, I mean, well, I lived most of my life in cities, although in the summers when I was growing up, my mom and dad were both from small towns in the Midwest, and that was our vacation every year. We would get into a station wagon, me and my two sisters. We would drive 2 days out to southern Illinois, and we would be in these two little towns. One set of grandparents lived in one little town, another set of grandparents lived in another little town. And they were little old-fashioned towns, town square, little post office. So my summers were spent there with my cousins, and it was really quite amazing to us, you know, how contained these little towns were. People sat on their porches, on their porch swings, and so there was a very strong sense of community in that that I don't think we had so much. My dad, we moved a lot when I was a kid, but we were often in kind of urban and suburban situations, never in the country. And so I don't know that I felt I had much of a sense of community growing up. The acting community really became my community when I started to work in the theater when I was 22. That really became my family in the world, like other fellow actors and directors and, you know, then later designers and people who worked in that world. I felt, you know, if a person kind of finds their tribe or something, I think meeting artists when I was 18, 19, 20, 21, and then on into life, I felt like I was with my tribe when I was with all different kinds of artists, musicians, actors, painters, you know. It just had to do with a kind of way, you know, I guess the lens through which I feel like they look at the world. It always felt like a larger aperture.
If you could go back 10 years and give yourself a piece of advice, what would it be and why?
You know, I think my advice always to myself would be kind of not to stress out so much about stuff. You know, because you really do on some level see, you know, how things do pass, things do, you know, you get through things and things, you think you know things that sometimes, you know, there's a beautiful, I mean, the advice I like to follow is a beautiful kind of little Buddhist cone. It's sort of, you know, prolong not the past, invite not the future, do not alternate your innate wakefulness, fear not appearances, very important one. There is nothing more than this. So it's like my advice would be, to let that guide me more, because we do fear appearances. Things happen around us and we are thrown by them and stuff. But the fact is, when you look back on something that seemed very traumatic or dramatic at the time, a year later, sometimes you have to laugh at yourself. I mean, sometimes things work out just fine that you think are going awry, or, something is not getting, the love it needs, or it's not moving in the right direction, or you're not able to make something happen that you're trying to make happen, or bad things are happening to people you care about. But, people get through things and we move on. And
well, so speaking of advice, what is some of the worst advice you've received?
The worst advice I've received, I can't think of anything specific. I mean, I think growing up in our culture, there is at least the culture I grew up in, there's this sort of sense of like, that there's something to be gained by strictly following rules, or by understanding, watching your P's and Q's, as my grandmother used to say, that there is something to be gained by coloring inside the lines. And I think that throughout my life, what I have learned from my own experience is that that's not really the case. That I feel like I grew up in a world, whether it was school or family or the culture around me or whatever, that was always saying, stay inside the lines, color inside the lines. And every time you color outside of the lines, every time you learn from doing something, I've learned most really important things from making mistakes, or, coloring way outside the lines, or from something like nature that doesn't really follow anybody's rules. So, the things that have become my teachers have been, things that are not, kind of specifically laid out, like pathways that are laid out, and that, it gets interesting when you knock those pathways down and sort of tramp off, in a different direction.
Yeah, taken path.
Yeah.
How do you relax?
Well, I for me, it's often really about getting out into nature. Like if I can be around, somebody like Thomas Merton or something, who said it's impossible to be neurotic in the presence of a tree. And I think it's really true. I mean, you might start off taking your neurosis to the tree, but the tree really has no interest in it at all. And I think, when I get really out in the woods and get out around, just plants and particularly trees. I have going back to my childhood, a very strong relationship with trees, or water, or the ocean, or, just when I get into the presence of nature and I can just get quiet enough in my own mind to let all of the reactiveness and all of the, I just feel like we are constantly inundated by, information and stuff. And we sometimes think that stuff has something to do with who we are. And it really doesn't very much. And if I can get quiet enough where all that stuff goes away and I'm not reacting to information coming at me, I'm not responding, and I'm just quiet, I start to have like my own thoughts. It surprises me. It's like, oh, that's a thought that had nothing to do with anything coming from outside towards me, but it's bubbling up from inside of me. And that's the kind of part of me that I want to get to know. And I feel like when I get there, it does relax me. Like I am relaxed in that state. I want to say I have a great meditation practice. I have a pretty erratic meditation practice. And sometimes I don't feel relaxed at all when I meditate. Sometimes I feel really agitated. I have to work, I would have to really work with my own restlessness and my own inability to relax. I used to have a really disciplined yoga practice. That's gone the way of, most disciplines, you're disciplined while you're just, and then you go off and you get busy doing other stuff. And I have two beautiful cats that I absolutely love. And I feel relaxed when I'm with them. They kind of just come and hang out with me, and that's pretty relaxing. I love to read. That reading is relaxing to me. I used to run. Running used to be relaxing to me, but now I have a knee that is not happy when I run. So.
Guilty pleasures.
Guilty pleasures. Yes, I would say two of them. I'm right in the middle of them now. Are The Voice and American Idol. Those are my guilty pleasures. But I feel very moved by these young singers. I love to watch them develop, and I love to see them, get up there and take a chance. And I love this idea, of somebody, being a janitor in Idaho, and then suddenly, they're, in the top 10 of American Idol, and they have a voice that brings you to tears. That there's something about that. It's a true guilty pleasure, because I almost tell no one that I watch these shows. But I love them. I love them. I mean, really, I wouldn't miss an episode of them. I tape them, and I'm like, what else? Diet Coke. That's a guilty pleasure. I really like Diet Coke. I know it's terrible for you. Other than that, I have a pretty good diet, but I have to have a Diet Coke every now and then. What are my other guilty pleasures? Those are the only ones that come to mind. I'm sure there's others, but...
Growing up, who was your favorite fictional character?
Well, when I was really little, I loved all the characters in Dr. Seuss. And in fact, I started a correspondence with Dr. Seuss. And I would write little stories, Dr. Seuss type of stories to him, and send them to him, kind of mimicking him. And I think when I was really little, I loved the world he created. I loved his, Grinches and his, all of his wonderful characters. I remember loving Nancy Drew. I love, good girl detective, kind of sneaking out of the house and all. She had a little bit of sort of polite rebel in her.
She could mind her P's and Q's, but also all the crime.
That's right. Fictional characters. Then when I got older, I think I switched over to actually non-fictional characters. Like I started to love people like Anais Nin. I started reading when I was pretty young, like Anais Nin's diaries. And then, all of a sudden it became about like people who were actually existed in the world, but they existed in a world that I'd never been in. And I felt like I was kind of getting to see the world out there through their eyes. And it was such a bigger world than the world I was living in, and it gave me hope, that like I could escape. It was like plotting my escape through most of my childhood.
Do you think you accomplished that?
Yes, I did accomplish it. Yeah. No, I did. I really, I grew up in a fairly conservative, my dad was in the FBI. And, it was pretty strict. I was in a very strict family. And, I never really, and we lived kind of in the suburbs a lot, or sometimes in cities, but, I never really felt like I fit into my environment. So I think I always was sort of thinking, where do I belong? Like I didn't necessarily feel like I belonged in the world I was born into or lived in as a child. And therefore the trees. I used to go to the trees,
Do you think if you had grown up in like a Colewell or something like that, that you would have felt the same need for adventure? Or do you think it would have just been kind of, the fact that you were kind of moving around so much?
No, I think as a kid, I had a very active imagination. And I think that the things that the world I lived in my imagination didn't feel like a world that fit into the world I was in. So I think that I think that I somehow believed that there was a world out there somewhere in the universe, beyond my family. As a kid, I didn't have a lot of experience beyond my family other than school, because we did move around a lot. So by the time we'd be someplace, I'd start to get to know other kids and other families. We'd pack up and we'd move someplace else. So I had a lot of experience of being the new kid, which made me very kind of insular in my family, but not so much connecting or having experience with the world outside of myself in more than a superficial kind of way. Yeah.
All right, so my last question is, how do you define personal success now, and has that changed from maybe earlier in your life or career?
I think that I define personal success now as really feeling, it's like coming into tune with myself. It's like there are times when I feel like I'm right where I should be, and I'm doing the thing that I'm meant to be doing, and I'm kind of doing it hopefully up to the best of my ability to do it, and working with people who I really love and respect. When that's happening, that feels like success to me. Like, I feel like I'm an instrument that has come into tune. It's like bing, and I feel like I'm fully alive, fully engaged, fully using myself and being used by my environment, and I think that I always had a sense of that as being success. The culture we live in, we get just so much, other people's idea of success gets so imprinted on us and thrown at us. And I think when I first started out being an actor, I was very fortunate in that the very first film I made, Animal House, was like wildly successful. That never happens, that rarely happens to people. And then the fourth film I made was Raiders of the Lost Ark, which again was like wildly successful. And that's a kind of success that you can't say anything bad about a film being like embraced by, a huge number of people. But it's a kind of success that you have to catch up with. I mean, it can be somewhat oppressive. And I don't know if oppressive success is success, from the point of view of an actor, the point of view probably of a director or writer. I know certainly I got to know Tennessee Williams in the course of my life, and I did a couple of plays of his. And, his success crushed him, success. And so I think I've struggled with what that means, what success is, what it means, clearly from the point of view of our culture's idea of success. It's not something you can hold on to. It's not really something you have that much control over. It comes and it goes, it ebbs and it flows. If you get too attached to the good side of it, you're going to feel like you're going to feel bereft when it goes away. And then, then you kind of become almost a victim of it or something. So I think I've struggled with it, and I've tried very hard to keep my focus on success. Really has more to do with the personal experience, that I'm having or not having. Because certainly I've been in situations that people view as successful situations where I was miserable, where I was very unhappy with the circumstances that were creating the success or something. So, you get to know at a certain point what an illusion all of that is. And then it kind of becomes, incumbent on you to figure it out, because you don't want to live in that place where it's based on other people's ideas of success, because it's much more satisfying to figure out what your own idea of success is and live from that place.